All right, so today we're diving into something that I think is on everybody's mind,
Yeah.
and that's the whole TikTok situation. What happens now? You know what's officially gone dark today, January 19th, 2025. And for all those 170 million American users, no more viral dances, no more quick recipe videos.
Yeah, it's really kind of like, wow. It just feels so sudden. 1 minute you're scrolling through your For You page, and then bam, a pop-up. It's over.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's, for a lot of people, it's probably like whiplash. It's like we all knew it was coming, but still.
Oh, there were warnings for sure. But to actually shut down completely, it's jarring. And the Supreme Court ruling was unanimous.
Yeah.
I mean, that really tells you something. The concerns about national security, about TikTok's data, and, the potential for influence from China. It was serious. This wasn't a close call at all.
No, it wasn't. And, I think a lot of our listeners are probably thinking about this, too. What happens to all that data that TikTok's collected? I mean, we're talking about massive amount of information here.
Yeah, it's a bit of a strange situation right now. I mean, ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, they've said they're not going to sell TikTok. So all that data, it's in limbo, the White House has said. They're open to solutions, but the security concerns have to be addressed first.
Right.
So it's tricky, legally, politically, a tricky situation.
Definitely. So with TikTok gone, what are people doing? I've got some friends who are already on Red Note, which I think is also Chinese-owned. Is that going to be the new TikTok?
Well, it's possible, but that's exactly what lawmakers here are worried about. The whole point of the ban was to, limit the influence of these Chinese companies. Yeah. So if everyone just jumps to another Chinese-owned platform, it kind of defeats the purpose. And of course, you can't count out the big players like Instagram and YouTube.
Yeah.
They're definitely going to try to grab those millions of users.
Of course. And speaking of lawmakers, there's been this interesting development. President-elect Trump, he's coming into office on Monday, and he's hinted that he might give TikTok a 90-day extension.
Oh, wow.
What's going on there?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
A lot of speculation, political pressure maybe, or maybe he's trying to use it as leverage, in some kind of negotiation. Trade deal, something with China, it's hard to say. But that 90-day extension, that could really change things by TikTok sometime.
Yeah, it would be a game changer for sure. So
Definitely.
This isn't just a U.S. issue either.
Right. Remember India banned TikTok back in 2020?
Right.
And Canada just recently took action too, this U.S. ban. It's a big deal. It could set a precedent for other countries who want to do the same thing.
It's even groups like the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they're concerned about the ban.
Yeah.
But for totally different reasons.
They are. The EFF is worried about the lack of privacy laws in the U.S. Their argument is that banning one app doesn't solve the bigger problem,
right,
which is data privacy. And they have a point. I mean, this whole situation really shows how complicated it is to balance national security and individual freedoms, especially in the digital age.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, it feels like uncharted territory. So what are the possible scenarios here? Is this the beginning of the end for TikTok? Or could they actually make a comeback?
It's hard to say for sure. There are so many moving parts. If President-elect Trump does grant that extension, that could give TikTok time to, maybe work out a deal with the government, something that addresses the security concerns. But even then, the social media landscape is always changing.
It is.
Users are fickle. They might move on to something else entirely.
That's true.
Yeah. This whole thing really highlights how quickly things change in the tech world, and the stakes are incredibly high.
They are. So I'm curious about the bigger picture here. What does this all mean for the future of social media? I mean, we've got these incredibly powerful platforms, often owned by foreign companies, and they're operating in this global landscape where politics and national interests are constantly shifting.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Governments all over the world, they're trying to figure out what to do with the power and influence of these platforms, especially when they're owned by foreign companies.
Right.
I think this TikTok ban, it could be a turning point in how these issues are handled going forward. It raises a lot of questions about data privacy, freedom of expression, and the role of governments in regulating the internet.
And we can't forget about the users either. They're stuck in the middle of all this, trying to figure out where to go, what to use, who to trust with their data. It's a lot to handle.
It is a lot to handle.
So for our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed right now, what's the one thing you really want them to take away from all this?
I think it's that this TikTok ban, as dramatic as it seems, it's really just the beginning of a much bigger story. We're at a pivotal moment, the choices we make about the platforms we use, the data we share, the information we consume. It all matters now more than ever.
So, what should our listeners be watching for as this story unfolds?
Well, first, keep an eye on that potential 90-day extension. Will President-elect Trump actually do it? And if he does, what will it look like? What kind of conditions will be attached? I think that'll tell us a lot about how his administration plans to deal with these tech giants.
Okay, so that's the political side of things.
Yeah.
What about on the tech front? What should we be looking out for?
Watch the other platforms. Will Instagram or YouTube? Will they manage to capture a big chunk of those former TikTok users? Or will some completely new platform emerge and dominate the space?
And of course, what happens to TikTok itself? Will they try to make a deal with the U.S. government? Will they be forced to sell? Could they just disappear completely?
Yeah, and even if they do manage to come back to the U.S., will it be the same TikTok? I mean, this whole thing, it's definitely damaged their reputation and trust among users.
It really has.
Yeah.
I think it would be really hard to bounce back from something like this.
It's a turning point for sure. We just don't know which way things will turn. It's a reminder of just how much power is at play in the digital age. You know, these incredibly influential platforms, especially the ones owned by foreign companies, they're operating in this global landscape where political alliances and national interests are constantly shifting.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about.
It is.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon to explore another corner of the world and untangle its complexities. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions.
And you know, this whole thing about data privacy, it's a big deal. Like,
Yeah.
we're talking about balancing national security with individual freedoms. It's a really complex issue. It is. It feels like we're in uncharted territory here. So, what are the realistic scenarios for TikTok's future? Is this the beginning of the end? Or could they actually make a comeback?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. There are so many moving pieces right now. You know, if President-elect Trump does grant that extension, it could give TikTok some time. You know, maybe they can negotiate a deal with the government, something that addresses those security concerns.
Right.
But even then, the social media world changes so fast.
It does.
Users can be fickle. They might just move on to something completely different.
That's true.
Yeah, I think this whole situation really shows how quickly things can change in the tech world and how high the stakes are.
Yeah, they really are high. I'm curious about the bigger picture here. What does this all mean for the future of social media in general? We've got these really powerful platforms, often owned by foreign companies, operating in this global environment where politics and, you know, national interests, they're always shifting.
Right, and that's what makes this so fascinating. Governments around the world, they're trying to figure out how to deal with the power and influence of these platforms, especially when they're owned by companies in other countries.
Right.
I think this TikTok ban, it could be a turning point in how these issues are addressed moving forward. It brings up so many questions about data privacy, freedom of expression, and you know what role government should have in regulating the internet.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the users. They're caught in the middle of all this, trying to figure out where to go next, what to use, who to trust with their data.
It's a lot.
It is. It's a lot to think about. So for our listeners, you know, who are trying to make sense of all this, what's the one thing you really want them to take away from this whole TikTok situation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this ban, as big of a deal as it seems right now, it's just the beginning. It's the start of a much bigger story. We're at a really crucial moment. And the choices we make about the platforms we use, the data we share, the information we consume, all of that, it matters more than ever.
So as this story continues to unfold, what should people be paying attention to?
Well, first, keep an eye on that 90-day extension. Will President-elect Trump actually grant it? And if he does, what will the terms be? What kind of strings will be attached? That'll give us some insight into how he plans to approach these tech companies.
Okay, so that's the political angle. What about from a tech perspective?
Watch how the other platforms react. Will Instagram or YouTube, will they be able to grab all those TikTok users? Or will a new platform pop up and, you know, take over?
And what about TikTok itself? Will they try to strike a deal with the U.S. government? Will they be forced to sell? Will they just vanish?
Right. And even if TikTok does come back to the U.S., will it be the same? I mean, this whole ordeal, it's really hurt their reputation and the trust they had with users.
I think it'd be really tough to come back from something like this.
It's definitely a turning point. We just don't know which way things will go. It's a reminder that there's a lot of power at play here in the digital world. These platforms, they're so influential, especially the ones owned by foreign companies. And they're operating in this global landscape where, political alliances and national interests, they're constantly
It's
shifting.
a lot to wrap your head
It
around.
is. It really is. But it's something we all need to be thinking about. What does this mean for our privacy, for freedom of expression, for the future of the internet? This story is far from over, and it's going to have a lasting impact. So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Great advice. Well, thank you for joining us today for this deep dive. We'll be back soon to explore another part of the world and untangle its complexities. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions.